It's the late 1800s, and one man controls almost all of America's oil. He's the richest person in modern history, with a fortune that would make today's billionaires look like paupers, but he's not content with just ruling the oil industry. No, he has his sights set on something even bigger: control over how we treat disease and maintain our health. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate who became the puppet master of American medicine. Dimes and drugs, oil and medicine, monopoly and philanthropy. These seem like unrelated pairs, don't they? But what if I told you they're all connected by one man, a man whose influence you feel every day, whether you realize it or not? This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, oil tycoon, ruthless monopolist, and the architect of modern medicine. In 1859, the first commercial oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania. By 1880, one man controlled 90% of the oil refined in America. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the breakup of his company, but that was just the beginning. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller, oil tycoon, ruthless monopolist, and the architect of modern medicine. We're about to uncover the dark secrets behind his success. Secrets that shaped the 20th century and continue to influence your life today. From the oil fields of Pennsylvania to the boardrooms of Big Pharma, get ready for a journey into the shadows of American capitalism. The truth is stranger and darker than fiction. It's 1839, and in a small town in upstate New York, a baby boy is born into a family that's, well, let's just say they weren't exactly rolling in money. His father, William Avery Rockefeller Sr., was quite the character. Known as Big Bill and Devil Bill, he was a traveling salesman with a reputation for, shall we say, unconventional business practices. He'd go around selling elixirs and calling himself a botanic physician. Yeah, you can probably guess how legit that was. But Big Bill wasn't just a shady salesman, he was also a man of questionable morals. He'd often be gone for long periods, leaving his wife, Eliza, and the kids to fend for themselves. And he even had a secret second family. Now, you might think growing up with a father like that would be a recipe for disaster, but for young John, it was actually a twisted kind of education. He learned early on about the power of deception and the importance of always getting the better end of a deal. Big Bill once bragged, "I cheat my boys every chance I get. I want to make them sharp." But it wasn't all bad. John's mother, Eliza, was the polar opposite of his father. She was religious, thrifty, and hardworking. She taught John the value of saving money and the importance of hard work. As a kid, John was already showing signs of his future business acumen. He raised turkeys, sold potatoes and candy, and even lent small sums of money to neighbors. But here's where things get really interesting. At the tender age of 16, John landed his first real job as an assistant bookkeeper for a small produce commission firm in Cleveland. It was during this time that John developed two major life goals. Make $100,000, that's about $3.27 million in today's money, and live to be 100 years old. But John wasn't just dreaming big, he was laying the groundwork for his future empire. This kid was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. The combination of his father's cunning, his mother's thrift, and his own natural business sense was creating a force to be reckoned with. But how did this ambitious bookkeeper transform into the oil tycoon we know today? Well, he wasn't content with just balancing books for long. In 1859, at the ripe old age of 20, Rockefeller decided it was time to strike out on his own. Along with a partner named Maurice B. Clark, he started a produce commission business. You see, Rockefeller had impeccable timing. Just as he was getting his business off the ground, the Civil War broke out. Now, war is terrible, no doubt about it. But for a savvy businessman like Rockefeller, it was an opportunity. The Union Army needed massive amounts of food and supplies, and guess who was there to provide them? That's right, Rockefeller and his partner. In just their second year of business, they netted a whopping $17,000 in profit. That's about $500,000 in today's money. But here's where we start to see Rockefeller's ruthless side emerge. While other young men were off fighting in the war, Rockefeller stayed behind to tend to his business. He even hired substitute soldiers to take his place. Now, was this legal? Yes. Was it morally questionable? Well, we'll let you be the judge of that. As the Civil War was winding down, Rockefeller and his partners started looking for the next big thing. And boy, did they find it in the form of black gold. The oil industry in the 1860s was like the Wild West. Everyone was drilling holes in the ground, hoping to strike it rich. It was messy, inefficient, and incredibly wasteful. But where others saw chaos, Rockefeller saw opportunity. In 1863, Rockefeller and his partners invested in their first oil refinery in the Flats, Cleveland's industrial area. And this is where Rockefeller's genius really started to shine. While other refineries were wasting 40% of the oil they processed, Rockefeller found ways to use every last drop. Gasoline to fuel the refinery? Check. Petroleum jelly? You got it. Even the waste tar was sold for paving. But Rockefeller wasn't satisfied with just one refinery. Oh no, he had much bigger plans. In 1870, he and his partners founded the Standard Oil Company of Ohio. And this is where the story takes a dark turn. You see, Rockefeller wasn't content with just being successful. He wanted to dominate the entire oil industry. And he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. One of Rockefeller's most infamous moves came to be known as the Cleveland Massacre. In just 4 months in 1872, Standard Oil absorbed 22 of its 26 Cleveland competitors. How did he do it? Well, let's just say Rockefeller wasn't above using some pretty underhanded tactics. He'd show his competitors his books, demonstrating how futile it was to compete with Standard Oil. Then he'd make them an offer to buy them out, and if they refused, well, Rockefeller would simply tell them he'd run them into bankruptcy and buy up their assets at auction. But here's the really devious part. Rockefeller didn't actually want to eliminate all competition. As his partner Pratt said, competitors we must have. If we absorb them, it surely will bring up another. Rockefeller saw himself as the industry's savior, absorbing the weak to make the industry stronger and more efficient. Now, let's talk about one of the most controversial chapters in Rockefeller's early career, the South Improvement Company scheme. This was a plan so audacious, so blatantly anti-competitive, that it sparked outrage across the oil industry. The idea was simple but devious. Rockefeller and a group of other refiners formed a secret alliance with the railroads. The deal? The railroads would give them massive discounts and rebates on oil shipments. We're talking up to 50% here. But that's not all. They'd also get rebates on their competitors' shipments. To make matters worse, the railroads agreed to raise shipping rates for everyone else. It was a plan designed to crush all competition in one fell swoop. When news of this scheme leaked out, it caused an uproar. Independent oil producers were outraged, and there were even reports of boycotts and vandalism against Standard Oil. The South Improvement Company scheme ultimately fell apart under public pressure. But for Rockefeller, it was just a minor setback. He had gotten a taste of the power that came with controlling transportation, and he wasn't about to let that go. In the years that followed, Rockefeller continued to expand Standard Oil's reach. He built pipelines to transport oil, cutting out the railroads entirely when it suited him. He bought up competitors left and right, often using the same tactics he'd employed in the Cleveland Massacre. By the end of the 1870s, Standard Oil was refining over 90% of the oil in the US. Rockefeller had become a millionaire many times over, and he was just getting started. And by the 1880s, Standard Oil wasn't just a company, it was an empire. Standard Oil didn't just control refining anymore. Oh no, Rockefeller wanted it all. They built their own pipelines, bought their own trains, and even started their own barrel-making operations. If it had anything to do with oil, Rockefeller wanted Standard Oil to control it. By now, Standard Oil had grown so large that it was becoming difficult to manage. Rockefeller and his lawyers came up with a clever solution, the trust. In 1882, they created the Standard Oil Trust. It was a new type of business structure that allowed Rockefeller to control multiple companies across different states. The trust was run by 9 trustees, with Rockefeller at the helm, of course. With the trust in place, Rockefeller's tactics for dealing with competition became even more ruthless. He'd use a technique called predatory pricing, selling oil at a loss in a competitor's territory until they went out of business. Then, once the competition was gone, he'd jack up the prices again. But that wasn't all. If a competitor refused to sell out, Rockefeller would sometimes resort to more direct methods. There were reports of Standard Oil employees sabotaging rivals' equipment or bribing their workers to cause accidents. Now, let's talk about one of the darkest chapters in Rockefeller's history, the Ludlow Massacre. This wasn't directly related to Standard Oil, but it shows just how far Rockefeller was willing to go to protect his interests. In 1914, coal miners in Colorado, working for a Rockefeller-owned company, went on strike for better working conditions. Rockefeller's response? He hired a private militia to break the strike. What followed was a brutal confrontation that left dozens dead, including women and children. The public was outraged, and Rockefeller's reputation took a massive hit. But did it change his ways? Not really. By the turn of the century, Standard Oil controlled about 90% of oil production in the United States. Rockefeller had become the richest man in the country, with a fortune that would be worth hundreds of billions in today's money. But all this success came at a price. Standard Oil's tactics had made Rockefeller one of the most hated men in America. Newspapers called him a robber baron, politicians railed against the dangers of monopolies. And a new breed of investigative journalists was starting to dig into Standard Oil's dirty secrets. They were called muckrakers, and their job was to dig up dirt on the rich and powerful. And boy, did John D. Rockefeller give them plenty to work with. One of these muckrakers was a woman named Ida Tarbell. Now, Ida wasn't just any journalist. She had a personal stake in this story. Her father had been an independent oil producer in Pennsylvania, and she had seen firsthand how Standard Oil's tactics had crushed small businesses like her family's. In 1902, Tarbell began publishing a series of articles in McClure's magazine about the history of Standard Oil. But this wasn't just a dry business story. Oh no, Tarbell had done her homework, and she was about to blow the lid off Rockefeller's entire operation. Tarbell spent 2 years digging into Standard Oil's past. She uncovered documents that Standard Oil had tried to destroy, revealing the company's shady beginnings with the South Improvement Company. She exposed the secret rebates, the predatory pricing, and the strong-arm tactics that Rockefeller had used to build his empire. When Tarbell's articles were collected into a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, it became a sensation. The public was outraged by the revelations. Rockefeller, who had always avoided the press, found himself in the spotlight, and it wasn't flattering. While Tarbell was exposing Standard Oil in the press, another formidable opponent was gearing up to take on Rockefeller. President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had come to office with a mission to break up the big business trusts that dominated the American economy. He saw these monopolies as a threat to fair competition and the American way of life. And Standard Oil? Well, it was the biggest trust of them all. In 1906, Roosevelt's administration filed an antitrust lawsuit against Standard Oil. The charge? Violating the Sherman Antitrust Act by monopolizing the oil industry. The stage was set for a legal battle that would shape the future of American business. The case against Standard Oil dragged on for years. But in 1911, the Supreme Court finally reached a decision, and it was a bombshell. The court ruled that Standard Oil was indeed an illegal monopoly. The verdict? The trust had to be broken up into 34 separate companies. It was a stunning defeat for Rockefeller and a landmark moment in American business history. Now, you might think this would be the end of Rockefeller's reign, but here's the twist: it wasn't. The breakup actually made Rockefeller even richer. As the separate companies flourished, the value of Rockefeller's shares skyrocketed. Within a few years, his net worth had more than doubled. But while Rockefeller's wealth grew, his public image was in tatters. He was seen as the very symbol of corporate greed and corruption. It was clear that if he wanted to salvage his legacy, he needed to change tack. This is where our story takes an interesting turn. As Rockefeller stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his oil empire, he turned his attention and his vast fortune to philanthropy, and one area that particularly interested him was medicine. Now, you might be thinking, that's nice of him. But hold on, because there's more to this story than meets the eye. Rockefeller's foray into medicine wasn't just about charity, it was about control. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation, Andrew Carnegie was another industrial tycoon, commissioned a report on medical education in America. This became known as the Flexner Report, and it would change the face of American medicine forever. The report was highly critical of many medical schools, particularly those teaching alternative forms of medicine like homeopathy, naturopathy, and herbal medicine. It advocated for a standardized, science-based approach to medical education. Now, here's where Rockefeller comes in. He used the Flexner Report as a blueprint to reshape American medicine according to his vision. Through his General Education Board, Rockefeller poured millions of dollars into select medical schools that followed the report's recommendations. But Rockefeller didn't stop there. He saw an opportunity to create a new kind of monopoly, one over the entire medical industry. His approach was multifaceted and far-reaching. First, Rockefeller set about standardizing medical education. By funding only schools that followed the Flexner model, he effectively standardized medical education around a pharmaceutical-based approach. This ensured that future generations of doctors would be trained in a way that aligned with his interests. Next, he turned his attention to suppressing alternative medicine. Schools teaching alternative medicine lost funding and were forced to close. This strategic move eliminated competition from natural healing methods, further cementing the dominance of pharmaceutical-based treatments. Rockefeller also exerted control over medical research. While he funded numerous studies, his support was primarily directed towards treatments that could be patented and sold for profit. This approach shaped the direction of medical research for decades to come. Through his foundations, Rockefeller gained significant influence over health policy at both the state and federal level. This allowed him to shape the regulatory environment in ways that favored his pharmaceutical interests. Finally, Rockefeller helped create medical philanthropies that promoted the use of pharmaceutical drugs. These organizations worked to create demand for the very products that Rockefeller's companies were producing, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of influence and profit. Through these interconnected strategies, Rockefeller effectively reshaped the American medical landscape, creating a system that continues to prioritize pharmaceutical interventions to this day. The result of all this? The birth of what we now call Big Pharma. Rockefeller's oil-derived pharmaceuticals became the foundation of modern medicine. Natural remedies were sidelined, labeled as quackery. The healthcare system became increasingly reliant on patented drugs. Rockefeller's ambitions weren't limited to America. In 1914, his foundation received a $12 million grant to modernize medical education in China. The goal? To replace traditional Chinese medicine with Western medicine, just as they had done in America. While they managed to establish a hospital in Beijing, their plans to expand further were stalled by increasing expenses. But the attempt itself shows the global scale of Rockefeller's medical ambitions. So, what's the legacy of Rockefeller's involvement in medicine? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, his funding helped advance medical research and improve the quality of medical education. Diseases were cured, lives were saved. But on the other hand, his influence led to a narrowing of medical education and practice. Alternative therapies with centuries of use were sidelined, and the foundation was laid for a healthcare system that often prioritizes profitable treatments over preventative care or natural remedies. As you can see how Rockefeller's Standard Oil approach, eliminating competition, controlling supply, and shaping policy, extended far beyond the oil industry. Even as his oil empire was broken up, he was building a new kind of monopoly in the world of medicine. By the time Rockefeller retired from day-to-day business in the early 1900s, he had accumulated a fortune that boggled the mind. In 1913, his wealth was estimated at about $900 million. That's about $23.5 billion in today's money. But some estimates put his peak wealth even higher, at the equivalent of $400 billion in today's terms. Either way, Rockefeller was, without a doubt, the richest person in modern history. Now, Rockefeller had always been a charitable man in his own way. Even as a young clerk, he'd given a portion of his earnings to his church. But as his wealth grew to astronomical levels, he began to think about charity on a much grander scale. In 1897, Rockefeller's son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., became his father's key philanthropic advisor. Together, they would reshape the very concept of charitable giving in America. In 1913, Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Foundation. This wasn't just any charity, it was a new kind of institution designed to address the root causes of social problems, rather than just treating the symptoms. One of Rockefeller's key focus areas was education. He gave generously to colleges and universities across America. The University of Chicago, in particular, benefited enormously from his largesse. Rockefeller poured $80 million into the school, declaring it the best investment I ever made. But Rockefeller's educational philanthropy wasn't limited to the United States. He funded schools and colleges around the world, including the establishment of Peking Union Medical College in China. Rockefeller also turned his attention to public health. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, established in 1909, worked to eradicate hookworm disease in the American South. This was followed by campaigns against yellow fever and malaria. These efforts saved countless lives and helped establish the field of public health as we know it today. The Rockefeller Foundation played a key role in establishing schools of public health at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and the University of Michigan. Now, all this philanthropy certainly helped improve Rockefeller's public image. The man once vilified as a ruthless robber baron was now being hailed as a great benefactor of humanity. But here's the thing, Rockefeller's philanthropy, like his business practices, wasn't without controversy. Critics argued that Rockefeller was using his charitable donations to shape society according to his own vision. And they weren't entirely wrong. Through his foundations, Rockefeller gained enormous influence over education, medicine, and scientific research. Remember how we talked about Rockefeller's influence on medicine? Well, his philanthropy in this area continued well into his later years. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University, became a powerhouse of biomedical research, associated with numerous Nobel Prize winners. But the institute also played a key role in promoting the pharmaceutical approach to medicine that Rockefeller had helped establish. Natural and holistic healing methods remained sidelined, while drug-based treatments became the norm. Some scholars have argued that Rockefeller's philanthropy amounted to a form of social engineering. By funding certain types of research and education while ignoring others, Rockefeller was able to shape public policy and social norms. For example, the Rockefeller Foundation's support for population control initiatives in the mid-20th century has been criticized as a form of eugenics. While the Foundation's intentions may have been good, these programs sometimes had unintended negative consequences, particularly in developing countries. As Rockefeller aged, he became something of a public curiosity. People were fascinated by the spectacle of the world's richest man handing out dimes to children and adults alike, a habit he maintained well into his 90s. But behind this grandfatherly image was a man still very much in control of his vast fortune and the power it wielded. Even in his later years, Rockefeller remained deeply involved in the work of his foundations. Rockefeller lived to the ripe old age of 97, passing away in 1937. In his final years, he split his time between his estates in New York and Florida, continuing to oversee his philanthropic empire. At the time of his death, Rockefeller's remaining fortune was estimated at $1.4 billion, a staggering sum considering he had already given away hundreds of millions. As a percentage of the US economy, Rockefeller's wealth at its peak remains unmatched, even by today's tech billionaires. So, what are we to make of John D. Rockefeller? Was he a ruthless robber baron who used philanthropy to whitewash his reputation? Or a generous benefactor who used his wealth to improve the world? The truth, as always, is complicated. Rockefeller's business practices were often brutal and underhanded. His monopolistic tactics stifled competition and concentrated enormous power in the hands of a few. And even his philanthropy, while genuinely beneficial in many ways, served to extend his influence and shape society according to his vision. At the same time, Rockefeller's charitable giving was on a scale never before seen. His foundations pioneered new approaches to philanthropy that continue to influence charitable giving today. And many of the institutions he funded, universities, medical schools, research centers, continue to produce valuable work. In the end, John D. Rockefeller remains a controversial figure, a man who changed the world in ways both positive and negative, whose influence continues to be felt more than 80 years after his death. His story is a reminder that history is rarely black and white, and that even the most towering figures of the past were human, with all the complexity that entails. It's a story that reminds us to look beyond the surface, to question the narratives we're given, and to always follow the money. Because in the end, that's where the real story often lies. Now, we want to hear from you. What part of Rockefeller's story surprised you the most? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. If you found this video eye-opening, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button to join our community of truth seekers.